We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
My name is Oz Davis, and this is Truly the Goats, sports history as told through its superstars.
For episode 13, Truly the Goats had on the show Michael Foley, a real triple threat in the sports history world as a journalist, author, and podcaster. Michael is a journalist and sports editor for the Sunday Times and a member of the Gaellic Athletic Association's History and Commemorations Committee, most recently acting as a driving force behind the GAA's Bloody Sunday commemorations. As an author, Michael has written Kings of September, winner of the 2007 Irish Sportsbook of the Year prize, and The Bloodied Field on the events of Bloody Sunday 1920. He's also ghostwritten the autobiography of Gaelic football manager Mickey Hart. In short, Michael was the perfect guest to speak with Truly the Goats about Irish sport. The following is the entire unexpurgated conversation I had with Michael on Ireland's sports, past, present, and future. Michael Foley, thanks for joining us today on Truly the Goats.
Yeah, great to be here, Oz. Thanks very much.
Let's just get right into it. Question I also asked Emmett Ryan on the last podcast. In your estimation, what sort of role does sport play in Irish culture in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think over the years, because we're such a relatively young country, I mean, you know, the Republic of Ireland won't be 100 years old for another 12 months. And obviously there's the 32 county version as well. So, I mean, in that sense, I suppose it's helped to form identity. It's much like any other country, I guess. It's helped to form identities. In the case of something like Gaelic games, for example, the indigenous sports of hurling and Gaelic football, those in particular, when the GAA was formed in 1884 and coming forward, really helped to form communities and pull communities together. So, like, you had a local team that you could root for, which would not have been the case previous to that. And if we think of the time that the GAA would have been formed, we're not even 40 years after the Great Famine. So Ireland, in terms of its own self-esteem, its self-worth of the people who were living in Ireland at that time would have been quite low. So to have something like that, something local, something to root for, and something to make them feel good, was really, really, really important. I mean, we see it coming up through the years. Then, if we move on, like even to the 80s, when the Irish soccer team began qualifying for major tournaments. They made the European Championships in 1988. They made their very first World Cup in 1990 in Italy. That had a huge positive effect as well on the self-esteem of a country that was going through a really crippling recession at the time. Immigration, absolutely leaking people to all four corners of the globe. It was a moment, again, of bringing people back together and giving people a sense of worth about the place they were from. So in that regard, it's played a huge role. And also, I suppose, just going back to the GAA again, around the time of the founding of the state, first 10, 15 years, going into the 20s, into the 30s, again, depressed time, and very much the GAA and other sporting organisations would really have provided, I suppose, the community network, the social fabric, and the infrastructure. I mean, for example, again, I'll go back to the GAA. I think we've gone back to that a lot already, but we could say the same for soccer and rugby. These are not municipal local government grounds. These are grounds that were built, you know, by the organisations or by local clubs themselves through dint of, yes, public money, but also money donated by their members and local people. So again, in the absence of that, I suppose, government investment in sport, traditionally, sports organisations provided that framework and provided people with the opportunity to invest in sport and to develop it along. So, I mean, it has a load of different sort of strands to it. Probably not unlike any other country, I suppose, when you boil it all down. But that's, I suppose, the fact that we have these indigenous games that aren't really, I mean, they are played around the world, but they're not played at a hugely high level outside of Ireland. So those in themselves, those particularly football and hurling, I suppose, have a different sort of a sense in terms of their connection to the country, and that sense of, I suppose, because they were born out of a sense of trying to be distinctly different and to create a sense of self-identity. They have a different feel around them, perhaps, maybe than other sports that you might find, more globalized sports, I suppose, that you'll find around the world.
Well, this is what it feels like. I'm glad you brought up the GAA and the formation of Gaelic football because, in the late 19th century, there's rush to organize sports, to codify sports and whatnot. But Gaelic football, the GAA very distinctly made it almost a nationalistic game. Like, for example, you play it on the hurling pitch, which is the Irish game. And that almost made it so that this game had to be nationalistic. It was almost like an island unto itself, as opposed to something like American football or Canadian football, which could be, you could cross over with those rules. So it almost feels to me like the GAA did it on purpose to be a nationalistic sport.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, when you think of, again, you mentioned it there, I mean, the context of the time, as well as an awful lot of codification of sport going on, particularly in the British Isles, particularly in Britain, and also amateurism as well was becoming a thing. The idea of a Corinthian approach to sport, public school sort of service type of idea coming from Britain, which it caught on in Ireland, but not quite in the same way. But anyway, that's another story. In terms of the GAA and the creation of Gaelic football, you're quite right. Like, hurling was a game that's reputed to have existed for thousands of years, and it was codified, and it was turned into the beginning of the evolution of the game we know now. Gaelic football was pretty much a creation. There was always forms of football played in Ireland, but when it came to actually creating a game, absolutely, the idea was that yes, we wanted to have the rough and tumble element that traditional games of football in Ireland would have had, but it's not rugby. And it's not soccer. There's no offside rule. There's nothing like that. They can handle the ball.
It's not even Aussie rules.
It's not even Aussie rules. And I mean, there is an ongoing sort of investigation into the connection between the two, because the rules of Gaelic football are quite similar to Australian rules, to the point that there's been an international series between Ireland and Australia now for the last, the first one was I think it was an exhibition in 1967. It's got series in the mid-80s, and it hasn't been played for a few years now. It hasn't been played for a few years now, but it's been kind of there. So there's that kind of symbiosis between the two games, and there would be an argument in Gaelic football now that the game is becoming too much like Aussie rules in terms of the rule changes and so on. But anyway, again, another
very
story.
Interesting.
But the interesting thing about the GAA being formed in 1884, very important to keep in mind that it was part of a general cultural and literary revival that was going on at the time. I mean, we're talking now about Yeats and Synge and Lady Gregory and the Abbey Theatre and all these things. And I go back again to this idea of giving Ireland a sense of its own worth, that it was, again, not even 40 years since the famine. A country that was, roughly 8 million people in 1840 odd is now 4 million. Between emigration and death from starvation and absolute desolation of the countryside, the morale is very low. The idea of having a national sense of itself is gone. The notion, yes, there are limited attempts at rebellion against the British Empire, but by and large, people are just trying to survive. So this idea, the GAA feeds into this idea of giving the people a sense of themselves again by reviving hurling and creating Gaelic football, but creating it as distinct from the games of rugby, cricket and soccer, which were very popular or were becoming very popular in Ireland at the time, to the point that the GAA had a rule up till relatively recently that, if you played Gaelic games, you could not play soccer or rugby. It was not allowed. Okay, so and I say relatively recently, I think it was 1971. I think we're 50 years since the ban, it was called. The ban was revoked. And again, it was a whole idea of, at the time, in 1884, I can't quite remember off the top of my head what year the ban was actually put into place. But the idea in the late 19th, early 20th century was, we need to ring fence these sports and their identity, and we need people to be completely committed to the idea of these sports. Now, it obviously took on a more political tone as the years went on, and independence was achieved and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland was created, and the idea of a ban then on people playing soccer and rugby, it became a bit of a bit archaic and a bit, it wasn't serving the purpose that it initially was created for. But certainly in the initial creation of Gaelic football, no doubt about it, it was created as an expression of exporting cultural independence, and that feeds into nationalism all in its own way then.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to keep people away from, say, basketball beginning in the 80s or 90s. That would be pretty tough to do.
Well, it's I see there's a lot of politics tied up with this. So, I mean, for example, soccer would have been referred to in Ireland as the garrison game, because soccer would have been brought over by British soldiers, and they would have been very strong in the towns and urban areas where garrisons were. Mm-hmm. So you would have had, it would have been a traditional sort of a generational thing. Then suddenly you had soccer families and you had rugby families, and it's still kind of, it's breaking down now, but you still would have there would be a degree of suspicion from the soccer crowd towards the GA crowd, and a suspicion from both the soccer and the GA crowd towards the rugby crowd. And, it's still there under the surface, and it doesn't take an awful lot for it to come out. But at least now I think it comes out in a bit more, it's not going to spill blood over it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, well, ostensibly the program is about the greatest of all time, and I wanted to talk to you about Teddy McCarthy momentarily, but you brought up another footballer prior to doing the show, Jimmy Barry Murphy. What can you tell me about him?
Oh, well, blessed be his holy name. That's what I can tell you about him, and I should just leave it at that. That's all I need to say.
No, seriously, I'll let you leave it at that, because I wanted to ask you this. Because of your reaction before the show, am I to take it that this question of the greatest all-time footballer in Ireland is unsettled?
Well, I think when we were chatting, we were talking in the context of a dual player, a player who plays football and hurling, okay? So in that case, you mentioned Teddy there. Teddy McCarthy, famous for winning All-Ireland medals in hurling and football in the one season, which is, he's the only player in the history of the game ever to have done it. He had actually a teammate, Dennis Walsh, on that squad with him in hurling and football, but Dennis didn't quite make the cut for the football. He was number 23, but at that time in 1990, they only gave medals to the first 21. So Dennis didn't get his medal, which is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. He won an All-Ireland hurling medal like 2 weeks before the football final, 3 weeks before, and he was sitting on the bench. He was with the team. Right. He didn't get a medal for the football. But so in that context, Teddy stands out like as obviously the most decorated dual, well, not the most decorated dual player, but the most distinctively decorated dual player for having achieved that. If we're talking about the greatest football player of all time, well, now that's a whole other kettle of guacamole right there. We're living right now in Ireland. We're living through an unprecedented era of dominance in Gaelic football, and that would be Dublin. And on that team alone, there is probably 2 or 3 players now who are already, while they're playing, are in the argument for possibly being the greatest players of all time. And we thought we'd already seen them, but we're in the middle of it. But you mentioned Jimmy Barry Murphy. I'm only kidding about Jimmy. Like Jimmy, see, for my age group, you see, I grew up on the legend that is Jimmy Barry Murphy. Jimmy Barry Murphy won an All-Ireland football medal as a teenager in 1973. Skinhead, crew cut teenager, just this beautiful football player. He played soccer. He was a beautiful soccer player as well. So that was his first kind of emergence onto the scene. But he became more known as a hurler. He won 3 All-Ireland medals in a row in the mid-70s and won 2 more in 1984 and 1986, just before the end of his career. So in that sense, for Cork people, JBM we'd call him, I suppose, for short. He's like I don't know what the equivalent is. He's both a cult hero, but also he's got the medals to show for it, kind of way. So he's got it all, and he was also an absolute gentleman. He wasn't He wasn't a dirty player. He was a forward. He used to glide across the ground. Like if he was running across a puddle, there would not a splash of water occur when Jimmy was running across a puddle. He just glide across.
Well, I think that in these arguments about goatdom, I mean, unless you're talking about somebody like Don Bradman in cricket,
sure,
there's always going to be this subjective element, right? You can never convince me that LeBron James is the greatest because I saw Michael Jordan. I saw Magic and Larry Bird, and they were, pardon the pun, magic. LeBron is scientific, but, he's not magic. So there's always that element in there. But I wanted to start with Teddy McCarthy on this episode, or I wanted to feature him on this episode because, of course, like you said, he won the 2 titles in one season. This is unprecedented. There is a list, however, of athletes who have won titles in both sports. However, it's not been done in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, I'm wondering, how is the effect, because we see it all over the world in sports, how is the effect of the 12-month season in Irish sport? I mean, is that happening where you must focus on one sport to the exclusion of the rest?
At elite level, for, I would say, probably the last decade now, it's become completely impossible to do both.
Mm-hmm.
You're quite right. The 12-month round. Now, I know, keep in mind, we are talking about amateur sport here, but still, the professionalization of amateur sport and amateur prep, or prep for amateur sport, I should say, it leaves no space. So you take Teddy, for example, now, in 1990, right? So Teddy was playing for Cork football and Cork hurling. He could pick and choose which training session he went to. Okay, so he largely went with the hurlers. Got to ask Teddy this himself, but I'm gonna take an educated guess that the physical training for football will be a lot more arduous than hurling. Hurling is all a real touch game, and if you've got decent fitness, it's all about your touch then. So he would have kind of gravitated towards the hurlers more. However, he also had an ankle injury during that summer. So, for example, he missed, again in hurling and football, you have to win your provincial title to go forward to the All-Ireland semi-final and then to the final. So Cork had Munster finals in football and hurling. Teddy missed both of them with this ankle injury that he picked up. So he missed a bit of game time there. He came on in the All-Ireland hurling semi-final. Didn't play particularly well. Got chewed out of it a little bit for not playing well. There was question marks over whether he'd start either final. But he had that sort of charisma and that kind of personality, and he had aggression, and he was an amazing fielder of the ball as well. Incredible. And I mean, when I'm talking about catching the ball and hurling, I mean, we're talking about no helmet, no shin pads, hurley's flying in the air, and I saw him many, many times at matches leaping and landing on the top of the shoulders of the guy in front of him and catching the ball out of the sky and coming down. It had a huge lifting effect. And this was a time when both hurling and football, particularly hurling, was a very instinctive game. You got the ball and you let it go. You just let it go. This is all getting to the point I'm going to make. You forward on 30 years, the game has changed. The very same as every other, so many sports now, it's become more possession-based. Football and hurling have become more possession-based. It's become more scientific.
And defenses are a lot more complex.
You have it now.
Yeah.
And so now, whereas hurling and football were once very much position-based, you had 15 players in a grid position, in a 15 grid, 6 backs, 2 midfielders, 6 forwards. Everyone had their markers. There might be little tactical deviations here and there, but that was essentially it. You won your battle and you got the ball away from yourself. And, there was a bit of possession play in it, but by and large, the game rolled along like in that way. Now, Gaelic football, for example, you'll have 15 men back and they'll defend en masse and they'll attack en masse. That requires huge physical strength, stamina, mental agility, multifaceted skill base. I mean, it's not just enough to be a back, a defender and a good defender. You need to be able to kick the ball over a bar if you get the ball 20 yards from the other goal. So all of these things add into the reality that at the very highest level, the dual player is really an extinct creature now. And also the fact that there has been a push to create more games in both hurling and football at elite level to justify the amount of training that amateur players are undertaking. So again, back in Teddy's time, it was straight knockout. If you played your first game in the hurling championship and you got knocked out, you were gone. You lost it, you were gone. You could go play football all summer. Whereas now, there's all sorts of factors. Now, okay, we're living in a COVID world at the moment, so they've gone back to knockout for football just for this year alone. But in normal times, the knockout has been gone now for near 20 years now. So it's different. It's just completely different. And it's beginning to percolate down now to the club level, the next level, the senior club level, which is the level below your inter-county elites. And it's even beginning to percolate down even lower, mainly because of fixture clashes and just the general sort of, there's too much damn training, really.
Right. Yeah, the McCarthy situation sounds a lot like the Bo Jackson situation.
Yes.
Where he would do that. He would blow off football practice, but then on Sunday he'd go play the games because he was also with the Royals at the same time. But baseball in those days ended at about the same time that football was beginning. Now you have longer playoffs. You have more postseason, more mini camps in football, in American football, for example. So, and it's like you say, too, it's also trickling down. You can still do, say, for example, track and field and American football in college. But even that's going away now, too. Even that, they're expecting you to play football all year.
No, that's it. And I mean, no more than Bo Jackson and no more than track and field in Gaelic games. And it kind of still applies that the physical work that you would do, if you're playing football and hurling, the physical work you do in Gaelic football will more than suffice for hurling. Even though hurling has become a hell of a lot more physical. Yeah. It really has become a lot more physical in the last bunch of years. Yeah. But it will do you. It's in hurling, it's touch. You've got to be playing it all the time, or else your millisecond reactions and so on will just get a little bit rusty, and that split second makes all the difference in hurling. So yeah, that's another reason, why it's sort of going by the wayside a little bit, the whole dual thing. But there's been some great dual players down the years. I mean, I was only thinking about it before I came on. I was just thinking about some of the guys. I'll tell you what, do you know the old saying about if you want something done, give it to a busy guy? That says it all about dual players in Gaelic games. I mean, some of the guys who have been great dual players have had so much going on in their lives, it's insane. Like Teddy McCarthy, for example, in the fortnight or 3 weeks or whatever it was, in between the All-Ireland hurling final in 1990 and the All-Ireland football final of 1990, his wife had their baby son, right? So there's a guy who was busy for a month. Nice. You had Jack Lynch, another great Cork dual player in the 40s and the 30s, won All-Ireland medals in both hurling and football. He went on to become the Taoiseach of the country, the Prime Minister of the country. My favourite one of all is Frank Burke from Dublin. Frank Burke, way back in the early 20th century, he was involved in the Easter Rising. He went to school. If people have any kind of sort of awareness of Irish history, the Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse was the main leader of the 1916 Rising. Pearse was a teacher in a school in Dublin, and Burke would have gone to school in Pearse's school. He was inducted into the Irish Volunteers by Pearse. Pearse gave him his rifle. And when it came to the Easter Rising of 1916, which was kind of a week long around Easter in the middle of Dublin, Frank Burke went to the GPO in the middle of Dublin, and he was there for the whole week. He was taken to obviously they lost. They were defeated. He was taken to prison in Britain. He was let out after a year. He came back and he won an All-Ireland hurling medal with Dublin that year. 3 years later, he was playing football for Dublin on Bloody Sunday in 1920 when 14 people were killed in Croke Park by British policemen who went there after 14 British spies had been killed that morning, and 14 people were killed in Croke Park. And Frank Burke was playing that day. He was actually marked by a Tipperary player who was killed on the day, Michael Hogan, after whom the Hogan stand is named in Croke Park. But Burke went on then to win more All-Ireland medals in football with Dublin, and he is considered, even though obviously we're 100 years away now, but I think his memory has been sort of regathered in the last few years, and he will be considered among the greatest forwards of all time. But what an extraordinary life around playing hurling and football. And again, to the likes of him, I've met his son. His son is still alive. Fantastic man. And his father wouldn't have spoken much about his revolutionary life. But I don't think there's any doubt that a lot of guys who would have played in that time would have seen their games as an extension of their nationalist feeling. That is not the case for the vast majority of people anymore. And to be fair, 100 years ago, it wouldn't have been the case for a lot of people either. People would have just gone to watch games. But for a cohort of guys playing their games going back to your original question about the impact of sport in Ireland, back at that time, playing the games would have been very much a statement of who you were. For some of them, not all of them, but for some of them.
Right. It really seems like you're really hammering home my feeling that it's almost impossible to separate the history of these sports from the history of Ireland itself. Looking at hurling last time, so many times the English government saw hurling as the symbol of barbarian Irish, and that this must be repressed, and that no, British people don't play this game. It's almost like the sports are a symbol of Ireland themselves, and that in the case of cultural repression, this is what gets repressed, is the sport.
Of course, but it feeds into that socio-cultural thing you're talking about. I mean, it would be okay if they were playing cricket and rugby and soccer, and absolutely nothing wrong with it. I'm a huge fan of all of three of them, but just again, how you can use sport and how you use language and how you use culture to impose itself upon a group of people as a way of, I suppose, rooting your life, your sense of identity onto another people. It absolutely is. I mean, hurling, you talk about hurling there as a sense of identity. Like, the Irish volunteers, where they didn't have guns, they drilled with hurleys. And that's, again, I'm always conscious of making this point. This is not a reflection upon the GAA. The GAA always endeavoured to be an apolitical organisation. They tried to stay out of all this stuff. Of course, it's very difficult. So if guys are using hurleys to, drill, there's not a whole lot the GAA can do to stop them. The GAA aren't going to confiscate their own hurleys. So, but this is, again, you're quite right. I mean, this is the vision that the British authorities at that period of Irish history would have seen, and you would see it in Northern Ireland as well, unfortunately, during the Troubles and even before that. I can remember a friend of mine at home here that I was in school with. He went to college in Queen's in Belfast. He would have gone in the early 90s, and he would have played hurling, and he took his hurley with him, and he only realised after a while that it wasn't a good idea to walk around, the environs, not the college, but around Belfast with a hurley. I mean, that immediately identifies you as a certain thing that we would never down here. Like, go play hurling. I'm playing it because I enjoy the game. I'm not making some statement about my political views. I'm just playing a game. Whereas in the north, it was a political statement. It continues to some degree to be that, but luckily that is evolving. And the GAA is evolving as well. You see it more. I see it personally more as more of a community-based organisation now, in the sense of, yes, politics and all that is embedded in it. And you're absolutely right. You cannot tell the history of Ireland without telling the history of hurling and football. But there is a point where hurling and football needs to be an opportunity to bring more people in. It needs to be a community endeavour that draws people together rather than pulling them apart or being distinct of itself from the rest of the community. And we're at that point now, I think, in Ireland, where the GAA is turning towards that sense of itself. That it's more. I'm not saying it wasn't outward looking before, but it's certainly more actively outward looking now. And that is a very good thing.
All right, just one final question. How is the future of these sports, seeing as how they're amateur? I'm sure that a guy like McCarthy will never have to buy a drink in a pub again. But how do amateur athletes survive given the 24/7, 365 spin of these sports? I mean, how do they make it?
With great difficulty. Like, the GAA is a very unique organisation in that sense. I mean, relatively speaking, proportionally speaking. Obviously, it's a tiny organisation. When guys get excited about hurling and football, I often kind of remind them, look, they're two fringe sports on a small island on the edge of Western Europe. We don't need to get too excited about it. There's 10 billion people in China that doesn't even know this is happening, or whatever. 1 billion people in China don't even know this is going on. So, relax, enjoy your day out, buy an ice cream, But I suppose the GAA, proportionally speaking, though, there are not many sporting organisations within a country, and the GAA is the number one preeminent, biggest sporting organisation in Ireland, 32 county, the entire island, that are amateur, that do not have any professional aspect to it at all. How are they managing? How are they surviving? Well, particularly in the last 20 years, there has been a kind of a move to sort of But what does amateur mean in the 21st century? How can we sort of make this practical? So, for example, at the highest level, again, at the elite level, players are now allowed to do commercial deals, do marketing deals, sell their image, do ads, get money for that, drive sponsored cars, do media spots, and they're paid for the media spot, right? That has had a couple of effects. I mean, one thing I suppose in a sense is that from a media point of view, it's made them more distant than what they were. Previous to this, guys, lived among us in the community, and if you wanted to call a guy, you called him and he was there. Whereas now there's buffers, there's agents, and there's PR companies, and there's handlers, and there's all the trappings of professional sports. The other, I suppose, major development was the creation of a players' union, the Gaelic Players Association, which is again for the inter-county elites. I'll talk about the club guys in a minute, but at the inter-county elites, so they're looking after them. They're making sure that they're getting mileage expenses, that the gear they're getting their gear, they're getting meals after training, that they're not losing out on anything. They would also run self-development courses. They would help guys in terms of scholarships for college. They would help them in terms of managing their life, their mental health. All these things are there now. So there is a support network. And you would, you talk to so many guys who've retired and they say, geez, I feel like I'm out of the bubble now, And these are amateur guys. They're going, there's not meant to be any bloody bubble. But there is a bubble, there is a bubble, and they are kept back and they are protected to some degree. Not to the degree of your millionaire sports person, I would suggest, but it's the same idea. In terms of the club guys, there will be a sense that because of all of this, that there has a kind of a disconnect occurred, because the inter-county game, the top end, is so vital to the GAA in terms of revenue and TV money and its commercial value is immense. Also, compared to American sports and compared to British sports, I mean, we look at the Premier League at soccer, gate revenue, people coming through the turnstiles is not important anymore, right? It's not important to professional sports. It's certainly not in soccer, it's not. Premier League could play in front of empty stadia every week. It wouldn't make a damn of a difference to them, as long as they get their TV money. GAA, totally different. 49% of annual revenue comes through the gates. So they need games, and they need inter-county to be a big fish. So there is a disconnect between that and the club guy. Club guy, and I'm talking about the club guy, I'm talking about the guy who goes down to his local field and there's 12 people watching the game. And the guy who plays for Cork, for example, in an All-Ireland final, will, a couple of weeks later, be on that same field with that guy playing in front of 12 people. But there's a gap. There's a gap. And that is something that the GA wrestles with all the time. But the idea, I mean, it's been a conversation for probably 40, 50 years now in the GA. Professionalism. Well, it's going to go professional. Does the creation of the Players' Union dictate there is going to be a professional game? Again, I go back to, it's two fringe sports on the edge of Western Europe. Like the TV deal at the moment, the TV deal for football and hurling is just over 55 million quid over, I think it's 5 years. Right?
Wow.
I mean, that's it's not a lot, really.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's
not a lot.
Yeah.
So I mean, how do you create a professional league based on two indigenous sports that really, with the best will in the world, I mean, pockets of people in America know about it, pockets of people in the UK know about it, but they're largely Irish communities or people who have connections with the Irish community who know about it, and they go, oh, this game is great. I mean, you go to New York. I mean, New York have team, like there was a New York senior team is very, very close to being entirely New Yorkers now. But what does that mean? It's not enough of a base to create a profession, in my opinion. They would have to completely tear up the entire thing. It would have to go a little bit like American football. There would have to be franchises. There would have to be salary caps, and there would have to be all sorts of mechanisms whereby the competition would be kept even, and you would be absolutely, well, certainly for someone like me, you will be tearing the roots out of the GAA in terms of what we know it to be. It would be completely disconnected from what we know it to be, and I think it would be a really damaging thing to happen to the organisation, because it does go beyond sport. It's a really community thing. That wouldn't exist anymore if it went professional.
We'll get back to the Truly the Goats podcast in just a moment. But first, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
I mean, it will be interesting post-COVID now. I mean, we're here right now. Only in Ireland is it now possible they're allowing 200 people into grounds with a 5,000 capacity or more. There has been a very, very long time without people in the grounds, which has crippled the GA financially, by the way. It's really, really left a serious mark on them. But it will be interesting to see what the reaction will be when the gates are open again and people can go to games. Will it have a positive impact, an upsurge in terms of attendance, at least for the first year or maybe 2 years? Because as you say, all sports have become TV consumer sports. They become streaming. They've become a streaming option, and it's something that people are becoming more and more used to consuming either on their phone, on their laptop, or on their television, rather than. I mean, I was watching a game of the Euros, the Euro 2020 tournament here the other day. I think it was England versus Croatia, and there was a piece of action going on, and the camera caught the crowd behind the goal, and they were all filming it on their camera. They were watching the game, but they were filming it on their camera when the game was down there on their phones. I was like, this is completely batshit crazy. I mean, you're at the game, snap your memory. There's your memory. What are you doing? I don't understand it. But then again, you know what? It's not for me. I'm not the target audience there. And I understand that too. But it just gives you an indication of how conditioned people have become now to consuming their sport and consuming everything through media rather than actually consuming it directly as an actual experience in a sports stadium.
Okay, Michael Foley, thanks very much for talking to us today.
No problem, anytime.
This has been a special edition of Truly the Goats. To find us online, visit trulythegoats.com. On Twitter and Facebook, we're at Truly the Goats. For more like-minded shows, be sure to check out sportshistorynetwork.com. Like the man says, it's
your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport.
Thanks to our guest for Truly the Goats episode 13, Michael Foley. Michael's books may be found at the O'Brien Press. That's O'Brien.ie. And I would highly recommend checking out his excellent limited series podcast, The Bloodied Field, based on his book of the same name. It's available at the Gaelic Athletic Association official website, gaa.ie. The Truly the Goats theme song is Fun on Street, greatest remix of all time, and is produced by David Liso of Dynamo Stairs. This is Oz Davis for Truly the Goats and the Sports History Network saying, Happy early 100th birthday, Republic of Ireland, and reminding you to keep on keeping that perspective.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings you sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long-sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.